This is the human right panel, my humorously titled look at a serious subject. I'm Rick Owen. You may know me. Every year, roughly speaking, I emerge from internet obscurity to help run QED and sometimes host the occasional panel. I try to get panels that I've got some kind of passion about, and for a good part of my life, I've considered myself to be very much human. So the idea of human rights has always been of interest to me. But I'm no expert, as you'll obviously come to see. You don't need to be an expert to chair these panels. I'm very well qualified in that regard. So I have with me two people who might qualify as experts, although they'd probably be too modest to admit that. I'll start by letting Emma McClure introduce herself.
Hi, so I'm Emma McClure, and I am a human rights lawyer. No, that's something I call myself when I feel like being pretentious. So I am a solicitor, and I represent primarily prisoners before the parole board in England and Wales. That's an area where rights are fairly fundamental because all of my clients' right to liberty has been taken away. I've been doing that for quite a long time. I do talk about my job quite a lot on... I was going to say I talk about my job quite a lot on Skeptics with a K, but then I realised halfway through considering my introduction that everyone who listens to that will be downstairs listening to it right now. But you should check it out. It's good. Even when I'm not there. So in addition to the work that I do in terms of the rights, I'm also a skeptic. I've been coming to QED for 10 years now. It's my happy place. I'm very, very, very pleased to be back. And I'm very interested in the areas where my day job and critical thinking and skepticism overlap. And I think that human rights and misconceptions about it is one of those things. I'm very happy to be here talking about that with you today.
And with us also is, after a trip from London that I booked for him, which is, I suppose, my human rights violation for the weekend, is KES Siddiqui.
Hi, everyone. My name is KES Siddiqui. I'm also a human rights lawyer. I specialize in immigration and public law. So I'm the Karen of the legal world. So I challenge predominantly the Home Office and the Ministry of Defense. And the challenges that I have been dealing with is the Rwanda challenge and also the Afghan interpreters who have fought side by side with the British forces. And my journey basically started as well. I've got a personal experience as well because I was a former refugee myself. And my parents originally come from Afghanistan themselves. My father claimed political asylum in the Netherlands. And we went with him. Mother divorced him. And lived there for quite some time in a refugee camp for some time as well. And then afterwards we came over here, and my passion for the law and human rights really grew, and I wanted to explore that and someday potentially helping individuals, which I'm privileged to be able to do now, and the people who were in a similar position to myself. And so that's my sort of background.
Just want to mention a couple of things about this panel. Obviously, KES and Emma are both practicing law in the UK. I know we have international visitors from in QED. Maybe show hands who isn't from the UK.
It's fine, Rick, because I listen to opening arguments, so I can do the US.
I think Americans kind of invented human rights, didn't they? They gave us the bill. Anyway, I also wanted to say something about, you all heard of Godwin's Law? Yes. It's the idea that on an internet forum, inevitably someone is going to mention the Nazis. The thing about that is, firstly, this isn't an internet forum. Secondly, it's a prediction, really, not a prohibition. And thirdly, when you're discussing something that's absolutely on topic and apropos, there's no harm in mentioning the Nazis. And they are very much to do with the human rights legislation that exists. I just wanted to mention something, I think, about my understanding as a layperson about the history of human rights, which is to say that after the Second World War, the the Allied powers realised they needed to do something to stop this happening. How could a Western modern democracy have conducted the things and behaved in the way that it did? And consequently, I think the first thing that happened was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm looking to my expert panelists to correct me, which I don't think was a binding treaty, but Eleanor Roosevelt was heavily involved with that. And that was followed closely by the European Convention on Human Rights. The UK was pivotal in getting that signed, and Churchill was very keen on it. I think he understood the importance. Exactly what the importance is we may get into later, but it is, I think, when the kind of people who have been complaining in the media about human rights and it's the way it affects our sovereignty, when the kind of people who have a crumpled up Union Jack for a brain are talking about these subjects, they sometimes say, comparing ourselves to the economic success of Germany, they'll say, what do we get for winning the war? Well, the answer is the Human Rights Convention. That's what we won. But they don't seem to appreciate it. Strange. A few years ago, we had a different Prime Minister. Obviously, that could have been a few weeks ago. David Cameron said that he was physically ill at the thought of giving prisoners the vote. So Emma, working with prisoners as you do, I wondered if you could explain why human rights legislation had any influence on that.
Sure. Just before that, though, just to go on back to, in terms of the history of rights, correct, in terms of the modern understanding of human rights. Obviously, the idea of rights is much older than that. You can go to the idea of sanctity of life and things like that are ancient concepts. And then you had...
Hammurabic Code, isn't it?
And things like that. But the modern concept of human rights, yes, comes from the horrors of World War II. And then you mentioned Churchill, but some of the framers, the actual drafters of the European Convention on Human Rights were people like David Maxwell Fyfe, who was a Conservative MP, prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. And at that point, the Tories were very keen on it. I don't know what's gone wrong. But,
David Cameron has a thing about prisoners voting. He seems to be happy for people to vote for criminals.
Yeah, well, Rishi Sunak breached COVID laws. David Cameron feels like a very long time ago.
Doesn't it?
So David Cameron has done several things that make me feel physically ill. I'm not talking about the dead pig. So he was talking around 2013, and when he said that he thought giving prisoners the vote was made him feel physically ill, and that at that point we were already quite a number of years into the saga of whether or not prisoners should be allowed to vote in the UK. So previously, prisoners weren't allowed to vote in the UK because the idea was that they had their liberty taken away, and there was a statute, I've forgotten the name of it, but it was a blanket ban on prisoners being able to vote. And a particular prisoner, Mr. Hurst, took his case to the European Court of Human Rights in 2005, and the European Court said, you probably can't have a blanket ban. We're not saying you can't ban prisoners in general, but you put a blanket ban on the right to suffrage or universal suffrage is probably not okay. Please do something about that. And then there was a very long back and forth where the government dug their heels and they were like, no, this is terrible, a terrible idea to let prisoners... I don't know why people think letting prisoners vote is such a terrible idea. Almost all prisoners are going to be back here at some point, and you want them to perhaps be a bit more engaged in society when they come back. Yeah. So the idea of total civic death is just not helpful. But
which party would they vote for anyway?
Well, so there were, around the time that decision, the Hearst decision came out, there's a few different prison newspapers. They're all called kooky things like Inside Times and Converse and things like that. Jail Mail. And one of them, I can't remember which one, ran a pretend election because prisoners couldn't actually vote. And the outcome of that was, one, the turnout was appalling because the turnout to elections is appalling. And secondly, this dates it, the BNP won. So given the current sort of makeup of the Conservative Party. I'm not sure what they're worried about. But there was a big back and forth where the government continued to say, no, we don't want to do anything. And then because they didn't do anything about it, a lot more prisoners then also went to the European Court of Human Rights, and there were hundreds and hundreds of compensation claims that were made by prisoners who were like, well, the ECHR has said we're allowed to vote, you're not letting us vote, and therefore, and one of the things you get from the ECHR is the right to a remedy when your rights are breached. And they eventually, what happened in this year, they've changed it so that a prisoner who's got a less than 12-month sentence, who happens to be on temporary release when there's an election, is now allowed to vote, right? And that satisfies the European Court of Human Rights. That case is now closed. We're fine. That's done. And what that highlights there is that the government often talk as if human rights is this massive trump card that stops them from doing anything. And what happened in relation to prisoner voting is that they were told, please let some prisoners vote 17 years ago. And then they ummed and ahed about it till now. They've made a tiny, tiny change, and the court said fine. And so there wasn't any it didn't stop the government actually doing anything. They wasted a lot of time and money just arguing over it for a long time.
Is a problem there that in order to get different nations to sign up, you have to water down the treaty, the convention, to the point where it's too vague, really, to guarantee any real rights?
So, no. But for example, Russia's just left the European Court of Human Rights. They've just removed themselves.
Leading the way, and sure we'll follow it. That's obviously around what's happened in Ukraine. They've obviously been sanctioned sort of by various international bodies for what's going on there. But the reason they wanted to remove themselves was they want to reinstate the death penalty. And one of the requirements of being a signatory to the convention is that you don't have the death penalty. So there are sort of there are sort of agreed sort of absolute minimums. Yeah.
There is only one of the convention rights. So there's sort of 13 particular rights that are enumerated in the Convention and in the Human Rights Act. And the one thing we actually missed from the history in terms of human rights is that the Human Rights Act came into force in 2000 in the UK. And what that did is transplant the European Convention rights into domestic UK legislation, which means that you can access your rights in the UK courts, whereas previously you had to go all the way to Europe to argue about your human rights, and now you can do it in the courts in your home country. But out of
ironically, much easier to travel to Europe than get on a train here. So,
so the 13 rights. So I'm going to test myself now. Right. So it's right to life, prohibition on torture, freedom from slavery, right to liberty and security, right to a fair trial, right to prohibition on retrospective punishment, privacy and family life. Thought, conscience and religion, sort of freedom to have those things, freedom of assembly, freedom to marry whoever you want, freedom of expression, the right not to be discriminated against in relation to all of those previous ones, and the right to an effective remedy. That's the 13, right? And autistic. But only one of those, the torture one, is the only one that the states can not derogate from. That's the only one that there are no exceptions to. All of the others, there are exceptions to, which again comes back to the frustration around how the government talk about rights. All the other ones, there are circumstances, including the right to life, in which the state can take that right away. But I'm not sure I'm going with that now.
Well, I mean, it's better than nothing at all, right?
Yep.
Qays, so if I break a law, if I break the criminal law in this country, I can expect to be arrested and prosecuted. What have the people you've been representing recently, what have they done to deserve sitting on a plane about to go to Rwanda?
The human rights, the European Convention, the article that I deal with mostly is the Article 3, But in terms of the convictions that they have, that most of my clients have, and I deal with the majority of asylum seekers, they have been put into this hostile environment where they're entitled to only £40 a week, and they live in horrible accommodation.
They're not allowed to work.
They're not allowed to work as well. So they resort to crimes to feed their family. So most of them are petty crimes such as theft, and they face criminal charges against that. And then eventually they pile up, and then they get potentially be deported. So majority of my clients that I deal with, they have petty theft, or that's what I deal with mostly at the moment, especially in the current climate where their rights are being restricted, and the only way that they can support their families is to. I know it sounds horrible, but it's the only way they can survive, because they are not being provided with their basic needs.
When you're not permitted to work, this is too little money to live on.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know, even if you're allowed to work, it's difficult at the moment for many people to pay their energy bills and go to the supermarket, isn't it?
Yes, no, absolutely. But then you get the other end of the spectrum as well, where with the Nationality and Borders and Bills Act, which received royal assent earlier this year on the 28th of April, they introduced a law to prevent smugglers from bringing people into the country, and they concealed it in such a way to show that it's there to protect the country from those individuals. But what they fail to understand is that the smugglers, they don't actually come with the asylum seekers. They arrange the travel. So they put these asylum seekers on the boat, give one person instructions, this is how you drive a boat, and off you go. And then those individuals, the people who are manning the ship, so to speak, they get arrested and are being done for being human smugglers, even though they are being literally sent off into the channel and expected to make their way into the UK, and they're being done for that, and it just doesn't make sense. And most of my clients that I deal with as well, they say that before they are put onto the boat, they're literally pointing the gun at them and saying, "Get on the boat," and you have to cross the channel. So it's like they don't have a choice. They either get killed or cross over, and then when they get cross over, through all that trauma and everything, they're being detained immediately, and for several months on occasions, and not being able to actually recover from the trauma that they have suffered on their journeys. And most of these individuals, they also are victims of trafficking, victims of torture. So all of that comes into play, and their mental health just spirals out of control, and that's their sort of human rights are being breached in the sense that they can't access their rights properly. They first of all don't know the language. They are unable to express themselves the way they would want to. But that shouldn't be the case. They shouldn't even be put in that position where they have to fight for their rights. We have to look at the root of the issue, which is the smugglers who are abroad. And one thing I forgot to mention is that these asylum seekers, their routes are essentially controlled by these traffickers. They tell them they don't have a choice where they want to go to. These traffickers go with them, take their money, sometimes £10,000, £20,000 from their families, extort them, and then travel with them, traffic them on the way, forced labour or whatever, and with a promise and selling them the dream that we're going to take you to the UK, you're going to have work and this, that and the other. But the main issue that they have is we just want to get out of the country because we face issues there, because we can get killed there. So they promise them all of that, and on the way they get trafficked, they don't get paid a penny, they're tortured and everything, and then on the way to the UK, they're pointed a gun at them and then told to come into the UK where they're arrested. So all of that it just doesn't make sense, and the Nationality, Borders and Bills Act conceals it in a way where it says that they're preventing these smugglers, whereas the smugglers are enjoying themselves on the other side of the pond and living off these vulnerable individuals' monies. And that shouldn't be the case. And it just, to my mind, it just doesn't make sense, this Borders and Bills Act.
So how does the Human Rights Act help you in your everyday work? And also, as a layman, it seems like two areas of law are kind of opposing each other here in many ways. How does,
So in my so the recent Rwanda challenge that I did was that two of my clients were facing removal to Rwanda. They received a notice of intention. We acted quickly on it. Went to the High Court on the 14th of June, the day of the flight. The flight was going to take off. Before that, loads of other individuals also received notice of intention, but they got cancelled. But only 5 still remained. And we went to the High Court, and they refused our interim relief. So we went to the Court of Appeal. Before the Court of Appeal, we also applied to the European Court of Human Rights, which was the saving grace, so to speak, because we applied for something called a Rule 39 application, which is like a temporary interim relief at the European Court of Human Rights. So we applied for that, and because another set of firms, they applied for it and theirs got granted, we also relied on the same grounds. And half an hour before the flight was going to take off, it got cancelled. So we managed to stop the plane from taking off. And I mean, at the moment, the Bill of Rights and everything, which we're going to get into, they want to get out of the European Court of Human Rights. They want to have control of our rights, which is dangerous.
You ruined, Qays, you ruined Suella Braverman's dreams.
Yes.
One thing that the government and the press will often talk about with your sort of work that you do is they'll complain that you're doing it like at the last minute attempts to stop someone being deported. Do you want to talk about that? Because in terms of when you're allowed to get involved, it's usually when they are pretty close to being removed.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we lefty lawyers faced a lot of slack for doing our job, basically, and we got bullied by the government during the Rwanda policy, and they were promoting hate towards lefty lawyers for doing their jobs, and it was a very sort of scary time to actually to be a lefty lawyer, because the government was promoting hate towards us and saying that we were just making last-minute applications to prevent removals. But what they failed to understand is that there's a whole process involved in actually getting to the point that you want to get to. And with the Rwanda policy, because it was new, we didn't know what was going to happen, and there was such short period of time. People don't understand with these applications where you go from the High Court to the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court to European Court of Human Rights. You get months, if not years, to prepare for it. We had days to do that. So if they didn't give us such limited time, then obviously we wouldn't be having to make these last-minute applications. And touching on that as well, obviously I'm because of my skin color as well, it was very dangerous for me, especially because as an Asian myself, most of it was aimed at us, because not long ago, another set of law firm in London, where I used to work at, they had a person coming into the office wielding a knife and threatening to kill them. So
specifically for doing the type of work that Qays does, a man went to the office of Duncan Lewis with a knife to harm a lefty lawyer because of the rhetoric in the press.
And it was an Asian man, so who got threatened. So, I mean, putting all of that into perspective, and the government actually promoting this hate not long ago, with the Rwanda policy, where I was heavily involved in it as well, it was a scary time for me personally, because I didn't go into the office for a very long time. I didn't know whether I wanted to continue doing what I wanted to do, but I just thought it was really important to send a message that you can't defeat us. We will still continue doing the work that we do, and we're not going to let you win. So. So in terms of that, so I didn't go to the office for a while, but after a while I did go back. And for me, it's also important representation, because growing up, I didn't have many people looking like me doing the job that I do. So I wanted to be that person for people who are like me at this current time. And that's why I do these media interviews and everything like that, to show that there are people like you doing this job, which for most of us, it's very personal. If we haven't experienced it, our family members have experienced it. So representation is very important to me. So and the government doesn't see it that way, and it's a shame, because both Home Secretaries that we've had,
which of our secretaries of state, which of our secretaries of state is the worst? No, so I just wanted to say, so this is the first time that Qays has ever been to QED, and he was worried before he came on this panel about what the reaction would be to us talking about our work, and in terms of, because he's used to the sort of the more right-wing narrative and press interviews of us, and I said he had nothing to worry about. This is a safe space.
Quite right.
Yes. So I was a bit worried. Yeah.
You guys have a PR problem. The thing is, it seems that you're doing a lot of representation of criminals, right?
Yes. So there's a H.L. Mencken quote, which I'm going to probably garble now, which is that the problem with fighting for human freedom is that one spends most of one's time defending scoundrels. Right? That's the quote. Which is because when we're talking about fundamental human rights, and another point I want to make here, these rights we're talking about, these are a floor, not a ceiling. These are basic things. And
no, if we're we can't possibly have better rights if we're stuck in the European Convention, can we?
It is people, the people who are going to find themselves at sort of taking cases to court in relation to their human rights are people who come into contact most often with the state, because your rights are our rights are against the power that the state has against you, and the people who come into contact with the state the most often are going to be people who are going to be prisoners, asylum seekers, people like that. And that's the reason all the cases that you hear about are about these people, because they're the people whose rights are more likely to be infringed. My rights are very unlikely to be infringed. So it's... But the problem is, then it sounds like it's the idea that it's a scoundrel's charter. But all the big cases that happen that you hear about, they do lead to rights protection for everybody. It's just that most people's rights are unlikely to be infringed, and that's why that's why the focus is on bad people. I feel like.
Okay, so.
I should just say I don't think that any of my clients are bad. I would call them epistemically unlucky.
I just want to tap into that, actually, because most people fail to understand that what we do is not just for our clients. If you look at it, it's for everyone. We're fighting for everyone's rights, and most people don't seem to understand that. And I think that's really important, because we're not just representing client A from Albania or client B from Iran. We're representing the whole of the UK and everyone. We're fighting for everyone's human rights, and I think that's a really important message to send across to people, because many people don't know that.
And because there are key examples of recent cases where us normal people were involved, where and there's one that relates to my area of work. So there was a guy called John Warboys, if anyone's familiar with that case. It was the black cab rapist case, where the parole board had directed his release, which was overturned. That's my day job. We're not going to get into that. I could talk about that for a long time. The specific case I'm talking about is actually some of the victims in that case. They brought a case against the Metropolitan Police in relation to the investigation, because they said the investigation into him was so bad that it breached their Article 3 rights to be free from torture, inhumane and degrading treatment. And that the idea that the state had a positive obligation towards them to protect them and to investigate these offences properly, and they won that case. So the investigation was so bad that they had suffered inhumane and degrading treatment at the hands of the police after having been sexually assaulted by somebody. And the interesting point about that is, I'm sure we're going to come on to the Bill of Rights, is that they wouldn't be able to do that. They wouldn't be able to bring that case under the proposed changes to legislation.
Yeah, so this British Bill of Rights I've heard talk of, clearly is going to be much better, isn't it?
No, next question. No, so the first thing to say about that is it's the most disingenuously named thing ever. Because I'm sure there will be people in the room who live in jurisdictions where they have something called a Bill of Rights. But a more accurate description about what Dominic Raab is proposing, why is Dominic Raab back?
Why is he?
Anyway, a more accurate description would be a rights removal bill. Because it is, if that replaces the Human Rights Act, it will reduce the number of rights you have. So every time someone calls it a Bill of Rights, I get very angry.
We know what they've said it's going to be, right?
So what they've said is they want to focus on what they call quintessentially British rights. So it's been a manifesto commitment of the Conservative Party since essentially the Human Rights Act was brought into force for them to remove it. And the most recent, the 29 manifesto, said they wanted to update, I'm doing scare quotes for anyone who's just listening to this, update it. And as part of that, they undertook an independent Human Rights Act review. So people independent of the government did a review of the Human Rights Act to see if there was anything about it that needed updating. And I'm not necessarily against updating legislation. Whilst it's important, it is just a normal statute, and you can always improve and change things. But what the outcome of that was that they recommended that there should be sort of a wide civic and public education program to teach people about what their rights were, tinker with a couple of the bits and pieces, none of the fundamental rights, but just more of the admin, and that was it. That's what they recommended. And then Dominic Raab had a look at that, and then decided that his definition of update was throw away and fundamentally change everyone's rights. So he wanted to strengthen the freedom of expression. He wanted to enshrine. I hate the word enshrine. Enshrine in law the right to jury trial, because we don't have a codified constitution. It is written. People say unwritten sometimes. It's written down. It's just written down in lots of different places. But even the Human Rights Act is a normal piece of legislation. It could be overturned at any point. So I hate the idea of anyone describing anything in our constitution as enshrined. But he wanted to enshrine the right to jury trial, which no one had mentioned at any point up to then. So he just pulling that out from somewhere. And then all the other rights they then want to make your rights conditional on like your behaviour, essentially. They wanted to limit the amount of compensation that you'll get if you've been badly behaved at some point in your life. And they wanted to prevent prisoners from bringing as many Human Rights Act claims as they bring. Now, as we've mentioned, they bring more than most people because they're in prison, that they are entirely dependent on the state for everything. But not that many. In their response, they go on and on and on and on and on about this one guy who sues them a lot, and it seems to annoy them. And on that basis, they want to remove everyone's rights, just for expediency, for admin purposes, apparently. But yeah, no, it's not. And I thought I'd breathed out briefly when it got shelved after Dominic Raab left in the little brief interim where we had Truss. But we haven't heard what he wants to do yet, but I assume he wants to come back and crack on, which is very concerning.
Okay, so the human rights legislation that we have does give us a right to a fair trial as well. How is that right being impacted by other governmental decisions.
So this is the other thing, which is that the proposed changes, which would make it much harder for you to enforce your rights in the courts in the UK, will then cover up the fact that the government are failing in all these. The government are failing in a number of fundamental different ways, and then the changes to the Human Rights Act will mean that you can't do anything about that. You may have seen recently that the criminal barristers were on strike until relatively recently, and that was in relation to another independent review of criminal legal aid, which the government looked at and then ignored. It's a theme. So if I sound very bitter, I spend a lot of time responding to these consultations in detail, and then the government ignore them. But the criminal justice system is in a state of collapse in the UK, and you will hear the government referring to backlogs in the Crown Court as the COVID backlog. Now, the COVID did make things worse, but there was a backlog there before because of austerity and cuts to all public services, the CPS, the police, courts. They closed a lot of courts. So there is a massive backlog of cases going through. And these are cases, serious cases, rape cases, murder cases, that are taking years to conclude in the courts. And I saw Dominic Raab, I think it was a couple of days ago, was boasting about the fact that the crime rate's gone down, or the number of convictions has gone down, as if that is a reduction of crime. It's not. They're all just stuck in the queue, is what's going on. So there's that, and then also cuts to legal aid. So there haven't really been any increases in fees in criminal legal aid since the 1990s. So, and the work that I do comes under criminal legal aid. What I get paid is the same as I would have been paid if I was doing this in 1997. And I mean the pound amount, it's not even gone up with inflation. And it's not actually, it got cut a little bit, it's actually less. And so the barristers were on strike to sorry, you've got me ranting, Rick. The independent review on criminal legal aid recommended that there needed to be an immediate 15% increase in the fees that were paid to criminal lawyers to save the system from complete collapse. That was a minimum immediate cash injection needed to happen, or the system was going to collapse. And what the government said was, okay, well, we will begrudgingly agree to 15%. Not for everyone. I'm not getting a pay rise. But the criminal barristers were agreed. But it would only start from now. Problem is, there's a years-long backlog, and all of those cases are under the old fees. And that's why they went on all-out strike to try and change it, which they have now done, and the barristers have gone back to work. But the point of all of that is to say that the government are doing lots of things that are infringing the right to a fair trial, and then they also are trying to change the rules to make it harder for you to do anything about the fact that your right to a fair trial is being infringed massively at the moment.
And Qays, how are your the people you're representing? How would they ever afford legal representation of the kind that?
So the type of individuals that I deal with, majority of them are in immigration detention, facing removal, through charter flights or Rwanda at the moment. But those are the individuals that I deal with. My work, majority of it is legally aided, and we haven't seen any increases either. So we have it just as bad as the criminal lawyers. So that's how we deal with it. So they have this rota system in place in detention centres where individuals can sign up and speak to a lawyer for half an hour and explain themselves through an interpreter their complex legal issues in just half an hour and expect the lawyer to take them up. But because there aren't that many legal aid immigration lawyers out there, most of them are just left in detention centres.
Yeah, we're very rare breeds, because you have to be sort of uniquely masochistic to do this, because we get a lot of stick in the press and stuff for what we do, and we don't even get paid well for it.
Yes, exactly. To deal with death threats, yeah. So that's how it works in immigration. So these people are just left there. They can't afford private solicitors, so they really do depend on legal aid lawyers to help them, and they're overwhelmed with the work that they're doing. And we see many people, legal aid lawyers, leaving to go to private practice as well. So I'm just worried about the future for these people and their rights to have legal representation.
We're talking about people detained like in a prison, but they haven't had a trial.
Well, they're in detention centres, so...
the biggest immigration detention centre in the UK has more people in it than the biggest prison.
Not Harmersworth.
Oh,
yeah, Harmersworth. So there's one in West London. There's two actually, Colnbrook and Harmersworth. And yes, they do have many people in there, and they are individuals who have overstayed, or they don't have any sort of rights to be in the UK, but they and the individuals who have just arrived through what I explained earlier by the boats and everything. So those are the individuals who are there. So they're highly vulnerable individuals who have been, majority of them have been victims of torture, horrible torture and trafficking. So they are in need of representation, because there's no way for them to navigate their way through this complex legal system. So their rights are being infringed as well, and I'm just worried about the future for these individuals, because everyone deserves to have rights and proper rights as well. But yeah, that's how it mingles with my sort of area.
But how I don't understand, how are we detaining people with no trial, and how can the Human Rights Act not? Surely that's a breach, isn't it? Oh, this is an open borders rabbit hole that we're in danger of falling down. Maybe we should ask the audience for questions. Oh wow. We have a box that we toss around. Please try and catch it. We don't want to...
We've asked to pass it rather than throw it.
Oh right, that's very sensible, yeah. We have legal experts here though, so don't worry. Well, we'll start over here. There's lots more.
No. If it becomes my area of expertise, something's gone very, very, very wrong.
Yeah, speak right closely into the box.
Quite simply, what can we do to help?
I think someone just said stop voting Tory, but I don't know if anyone. I'm not sure. I would be surprised if anyone did that in this room. It's a really difficult one, and it's the problem is, as alluded to, in terms of poorly paid and overworked. I don't have a lot of bandwidth to think about that. I'm firefighting all of the time, so it's hard to think about how to do sort of to fix.
So we've got to work it out.
So one thing is educate yourself about what your rights are. A lot of people don't know what they are, and they are a floor, not a ceiling. And then just like all of the big cases that when you hear about them in the press, I don't know, doing something similar to Marsh used to do a bad PR blog, which he should carry on doing, where there's often stories in the press around that misconstrue how legal aid funding works or how human rights work, and just sort of some kind of public like what was recommended in the Independent Human Rights Act review
would be a start.
Public education around what people's rights are and why and why it's prisoners and people like that end up being in the press. But if I get 5 minutes, I'll have a think about a more useful answer. But the problem is I don't get 5 minutes. I'm working all the time. I've worked during this weekend because it's constant firefighting. So I'm sorry I can't be more helpful.
I would just say that with the Rwanda policy, it received a lot of media attention, and because it received a lot of media, it's through protests and people on Twitter actually raising awareness about the issues and how it affects these individuals. So I think that if I'm not expecting you to go to protests and everything, but just even
I am.
just even educating yourself on the law and the policy, because not many people understand it. They're just being fed by the media wrong information.
There's the common thing about that one is that a lot of people don't realise with the people assume with the Rwanda policy that the thing is that they're going to fly them to Rwanda, they're going to process them, and then if they were granted asylum, they'll be brought back. That's not what's happening. If they granted asylum, they stay in Rwanda.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, educate yourself on that and raise awareness, like or retweet tweets, and you will fill the bucket if it's in drops. So, I mean, it's really important to do our part if we can't do anything more than that. Just a simple like or retweet of other individuals who are raising awareness, that can make a lot of difference if more people do it.
How about just following on? How about
Do you want to speak
contacting our MPs?
into the microphone?
I've got quite a loud voice.
For the video.
Okay. How about contacting our MPs? Would that help?
It depends if it is your MP Dominic Raab.
No, bad move.
But just before we ask another question, I just wonder, does anyone here feel a bit uncomfortable about like giving prisoners the vote, or?
No.
Fine.
We have that in Switzerland.
Of course you do. Yeah.
In Europe,
Someone put their hand up.
have the right to vote,
Yeah.
apart from the ones that they are in prison for political
Exactly,
reasons.
yeah.
So if you burn the flag of the country, then you by being removed from your political rights. But if your crime is irrelevant,
Yeah.
you're still part of the society.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You have the
absolutely.
right to vote. I don't understand why this
Hands then for questions. There's someone just behind you, two rows over.
Okay. I'm sorry for shouting. I was just saying that in Portugal, prisoners vote in every election. They're just a voting station in every prison. So when I hear people from Britain or from the US speaking about, oh, they want to let prisoners vote, that for me is so mind-boggling, because
Shocking, yeah.
I never knew that prisoners could not vote because they are still citizens.
Well, I'm glad to shatter your illusions about.
They've been shattered for the last few years.
Yeah,
But
I'm
my,
sure.
my question was related to Joe's, and what has been the public's reaction to this Rwanda law in Britain? People didn't enrage, didn't protest. Are they okay with it, like the general public?
Yes.
How it was?
So, I mean, as people, it's easy to receive information by just turning on the TV channel and being fed the information to you. And as a population, most people are quite lazy to actually read up on it themselves. So that way, there were luckily more people against it, because it is an egregious and horrible law, and it shouldn't have seen the light of day from my perspective. But here we are. I mean, it's just that the public's reaction was quite positive, and it was through these protests, because weeks before it, loads of people went on protests, and there are amazing charities out there who organize these demonstrations and protests. So through that, it received a lot of media attention as well. And then in response to that, majority of the public that I've seen were against it. So yeah, I mean, as I said, it goes back to my original point that as a community as people, it's important to raise awareness, even if it's just a small contribution that you're making. So yeah, I mean, the public's reaction was generally negative. Yeah.
But it's also part of the sort of the wider. So there's been anti-immigration rhetoric for a very long time, and it's part of a wider sort of right-wing narrative, kind of.
A cultural war.
Cultural.
Yeah.
It's part of the right-wing culture war, and that this is why this is one of the touchstones, one of the hot points of that culture war, because it's very easy as a right-wing politician to go, look at these, terrible, rapists and murderers getting human rights. How terrible is that? Or, these people coming over here, all of that rhetoric. And unfortunately, there is a significant proportion of the British population who don't consider these people to be human beings. They seem to have forgotten it. And it's very easy to offload your problems to them. And if you start thinking about people as not being human beings, then you end up back
Yeah.
in the Second World War.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. It's human rights. It's for all humans. We'll take one more question, because otherwise you won't get a lunch hour properly. From this side, maybe, because a question from the right, conceptually, if not. But it's your left, so it's all relative. Any questions? No?
You know the new bill that passed through the Commons the day before Liz Truss resigned, how is that going to impact your work? I think it was around political action, wasn't it?
Oh, it's about the right to protest, basically, isn't it? Yeah, they can't go protesting Emma, they've outlawed it.
So it's not going to directly affect the work that I do. So I'm not sure I can add anything. I mean, it's appalling. It's terrible. We shouldn't. The right to protest is.
Doesn't the Human Rights Act guarantee us some freedom of expression on those?
Yes, and right to assembly. Yes. So the part of it is a lot of these laws, on the face of it, do breach these rights. And what's going to happen is that they will be challenged in the courts. They will go to the European Court of Human Rights. Those cases will be won, and that will be used as more ammunition to eventually remove us from the ECHR completely, which is what I fear is what the ultimate aim is here.
Oh dear. Well, sorry, I can't end on a happier note, but we've got to give a massive round of applause to our two experts. Qays and Emma, thank you everyone.